Oh my god, the first non-horror video on this channel? Amazing! Well, if you think that, you're wrong. This show is a horror. At least to me. Now, there have been plenty of videos about Moral Orel discussing the various themes and stories that the show presented in its 3-season runtime. There is a lot to say about this show, and so, of course, I think it's time I throw in my own 2 cents, or in my case, 2 pennies, I guess. For those who may be unaware, Moral Orel is, or was, a stop-motion animated dark comedy show that ran on Adult Swim between 2005 till 2008. It takes place in Morrilton, an uber-conservative Christian town right smack in the middle of the US. The main character and our main perspective in the show is Orel Puppington, a 12-year-old boy raised in the devout teachings of the town, and over the course of the show we follow this chipper and naive boy as he makes his way through life attempting to understand the lessons taught to him by his father and those around him. The show is primarily a satire of this type of extreme religious fundamentalism, as it showcases the hypocrisy and contradictory ways that people of this town live and how this all affects them as a result. I'm not sure what you may be expecting the show's tone to be from this brief synopsis I just gave, but would you believe me if I told you this show is probably one of the darkest and most impactful pieces of fiction I've ever engaged with? Those who haven't seen the show may be laughing to themselves hearing this, but those who have, well, they know. Yeah, they know. As mentioned, the show has a lot going on, with many different things to pick apart and discuss, and in this video specifically I will be discussing the titular Orel and how he evolves over the course of the show, and how things around him change over time, specifically his relationship with his father, Clay. If you haven't seen the show and any of this sounds interesting to you, I highly recommend checking it out, although please be careful as the show gets very dark at times. Make sure to heed the warnings given at the start of this video as well, like seriously. Without further ado, let's get into it.
Orel, what makes you so happy?
Gee, I don't know, Reverend. What makes someone not happy?
Gee, I don't know, Orel. Life?
As can be figured out from the show's title, our main character is Orel. Now, if I were to describe Orel in simple terms, it would be as followed. Naive as hell, but pure of heart. Orel is a very trusting person and always tries to listen to those around him, even though we, as the audience, can tell whenever Orel is being led astray or taught something harmful, he usually cannot. Because he's a kid, sure, but also because of his highly trusting nature. This trust that he has in others often leads him into trouble, and this makes me very sad. His trusting nature often leads to him being roped into doing things that he does not fully understand the consequences of, being taken advantage of and misled by others, most commonly by the adults of the town, as he often misunderstands the rigid and confusing teachings that they try to push on to him. To me, one of the biggest parts of Orel as a person is his seemingly unshakable optimism and happiness. It seems that he's always got a smile on his face as he does everything with the utmost enthusiasm. He can easily find reasons to be happy, and he takes a joy in a lot of things in life. In one episode, Reverend Puddy asks Orel about what makes him so happy, sending him up to the podium to give a sort of sermon on his own. Orel ends up giving genuinely good advice about appreciating what you already have in life. Another big part of Orel's character is his sheer kindness. Orel is always looking out to help others and is just genuinely a nice kid. I mean, for God's sake, at one point he pulls out a list of, like, the things that bring him pleasure in life, and it includes good doing and giving. He's just so nice. This, of course, often gets him into trouble in a place as morally bankrupt as Morrilton. However, it does lead to positive change over time. See, there's the word that's from the title. Prepared to be hearing it a lot in this video. I'll be going more in depth on this later, but Orel's good nature often ends up rubbing off on others and causing them to change for the better as a result. Orel is just genuinely a good kid, however, his naivety often tends to cloud his view on what's really going on around him. Over time, though, this does begin to change as the show follows Orel's journey to realising the truth of the world and the people around him, and how he deals with all this as a result. This truly begins at the finale of Season 1, where Blaberta and Clay's marriage finally seems to hit a breaking point and they decide to divorce. Fucking finally. The family spends Christmas split apart, and right before midnight, before Christmas is over, Orel prays to God to fix everything, and he remarks that he has faith in God and waits. But, of course, nothing happens. This begins the start of, or at least to me, the start of Orel's slow realization that not everything is as wonderful as he seems to believe. It takes a while to truly rip off the rose-tinted glasses, but when it happens, it happens. Orel's naivety is a big part of his character, and honestly, probably one of the main driving forces in the show. He doesn't fully understand much of what's going on around him, and so for much of the show he has an idealized view of the world that he's grown up in. This leads to him, of course, having a warped view on why the people in town act the way they do. For a while, he doesn't understand the cruelty present in most of the townsfolk. Orel genuinely doesn't seem to believe that anyone would want to hurt him out of malice or for no good reason. This leads to him just sort of accepting whatever awful things are done to him by those around him and believing any justification given to him as to why these things are done. Because it's not like the adults would want to hurt him without good reason, right? They clearly have a reason to be doing these things. They're always right. Like, there's a clear justification, right? Right? Another big driving force in the show is Orel's quest to be a better Christian. Orel is taught a lot of lessons during the course of the show by the adults in Marlton. What usually ends up happening though is him taking these lessons far too literally and trying to follow them as accurately as he can, often misinterpreting them and unintentionally causing trouble in the process. For example, one episode is the Reverend preaching that a lot of things in life that bring us pleasure are actually the result of the devil.
Drinking to excess? The devil. Gambling? The devil. Self-pleasure? Devil.
He ends up listing off many mundane and everyday things, which leads to Orel interpreting this as anything in life that brings him pleasure is the work of the devil. This leads to him avoiding the things that bring him pleasure, but since this includes such things such as helping others, this leads to trouble. It also leads to some other things that we won't get into. This is a strange show. Orel takes these lessons so literally because he wants to follow them exactly and be a good Christian. That's all he wants, to improve his faith and be good to those around him. He's often rather misguided in his approach, to put it lightly, but nothing he does comes from any form of malice, just heavy ignorance. Orel does get a lot of things wrong, but with him it ultimately comes from a good place initially. He has no desire to hurt anyone and feels guilty when he does. For example, when he is pressured into helping Joe assault two other boys, he feels ashamed for this afterwards, despite being encouraged not to feel bad by his father. He genuinely just doesn't want to hurt anyone and cares about others' feelings, unlike many of the people in Marlton.
But maybe Dr. Potter's wheel's right. What if we don't know what we're talking about?
When compared to the rest of Marlton, Orel is very obviously different in many ways. The adults of Marlton are, to put it plainly, assholes. They're judgmental, dishonest, spiteful, pretty much any, negative word you can come up with. As to be expected of a town populated by this extreme conservative type of Protestantism, the townspeople are very unwelcoming to any kind of difference at all. The town in its layout is reminiscent of the 50s and is such populated by outdated rules and views. I mean, the town is literally segregated and has apartments for single women called the Alonefoot apartments. It's so funny that this place is literally called Marlton when its inhabitants are usually anything but. One of the main things to note about this place is just how performative everything seems to be. I mean, sure, on a glance it seems like everyone there are committed Christians and they're going about their lives happily abiding by the strict teachings they all claim to revere. We soon learn over the course of the show that this is all a facade. The people of Marlton are in fact not very happy. No, they're actually pretty miserable. As the show goes on, we get insights into the lives of the adults in town and we get to see just how damaging it is for them to live in a place like this. The unmarried women are shamed for being single and sectioned off in the Alonefoot apartments, literally named as a constant reminder of their loneliness. And the married couples of the town aren't faring much better, as any problems in the marriage are kept carefully under wraps as to not shatter the carefully crafted image of a perfect Christian marriage. This is most clearly shown with Clay and Blaberta's absolute train wreck of a marriage, one that they stay in to keep up appearances despite hating each other so very much. A lot of what goes on in Marlton is just that, an act. The adults try to maintain this image of purity and holiness while secretly, or well, not so secretly actually, being miserable and hateful in their unfulfilled lives, held back from what they actually want due to the harmful rhetorics that the town swears to abide to. It doesn't matter how faithful they seem to be, most adults in the town are quite unhappy or struggling in some way, but they choose to continue living like this for the sake of appearances. All this to say, Orel is not like this. Maybe it's because he's a kid and still relatively innocent compared to the older and more experienced members of his community. Orel, as previously discussed, is relatively chipper and happy. He acts as a sharp contrast to the cruelty and cynicism of much of the townsfolk. He does not have to put up a facade of happiness, that's just how he is. His faith seems to come rather naturally to him, as he doesn't have to go out of his way to force himself to partake in it. Another thing with Orel is that, despite being young and very impressionable, he manages to avoid the crueler aspects of the Christianity that is taught to him. He listens to what is taught and takes on much of it without question, at least for most of the show. This does change over time. What he doesn't take on is the more mean-spirited aspects of the adults' teachings. For example, when beating up the two gay kids in the woods with Joel, Orel is very clearly upset and feels guilty about it later, despite being encouraged not to feel bad by his father. Being in such a conservative town, Orel has of course got homophobia pushed onto him by those around him, but he doesn't seem to have taken it on. Of course, Orel isn't free from making mistakes and causing harm, such as bringing about a zombie apocalypse, getting the Figurelli segregated, draining his friend's blood, just to name a few examples. The point being that Orel's faith doesn't seem to harbour any of the cruelty that the rest of the town has. Orel somehow manages to avoid becoming genuinely bigoted and cruel like the adults, despite having that kind of harmful rhetoric constantly pushed onto him. I don't think this is all due to his childhood innocence either, considering how we see the other kids in the town act. Even when Orel does parrot the bigoted teachings of those around him, such as in God's blunders, it lacks the nastiness that would typically be present in these sorts of viewpoints, if that makes sense. It's as Tommy says, at least his heart's in the right place. Poor kid. Orel messes up a lot, sure, and does fall victim to the indoctrination pushed onto him and causes harm to others as a result, but he has no genuine desire to hurt others and feels guilty when he does, unlike most of the people in Moralton who seem to go out of their ways to hurt people. There's just no malice to Orel's actions. A very important aspect of Orel and his dynamic with the other town's members is his ability to inspire change in them. Many of the people of Moralton, despite whatever personas they put on for each other, are miserable and cynical. They hate their lives but are complicitly just going about the motions because that's what they think they should be doing. However, on more than one occasion, Orel is able to inspire them somehow to better their lives. One example of this is with Reverend Puddy, who we learn in the show is incredibly lonely and desperate to find a female partner. He is bitter and insecure and more often than not does not practice what he preaches. However, this changes around the time he finds out that he has a daughter, Stephanie. After a not-so-great meeting of her, Reverend Puddy has his conversation with Orel about happiness. This inspires him to pursue a relationship with his daughter, and after this we see him become more open-minded and less jaded. Whereas before, Orel's chipper attitude irritated him, the Reverend comes to appreciate Orel's outlook on life and is nicer to him. It seems that Orel rubbed off on him after a while. There are several more examples of Orel bringing about change in people's lives, but because of the way I've structured this video, I'll be bringing them up a bit later. As mentioned, change is an integral part of Orel's character. The whole point of the show is Orel slowly learning the truth about the town and the things he's been taught. His faith not only in his god but those around him is slowly tested, and his naive trust in nature begins to change as he starts to realize what's actually going on around him. For example, in the episode Elemental Orel, we see him start to realize how unhappy his parents' marriage is, which affects him a lot. The biggest source of change in his life, however, is that of his relationship with his father.
I could never love you more. People only have a certain amount of love in them, and I'm afraid I have to divide mine up between at least a dozen people.
It's time to talk about Orel and Clay, the main subject of this video. Now, Moral Orel is all about change, and this takes many forms in the show. One of the main themes of change is showcased of the relationship between Orel and his father, as we see it change drastically over time. Orel and Clay's dynamic is probably one of the most important in the show, I'd say. I mean, it makes sense considering Orel's the protagonist and Clay is probably the closest we get to a main antagonist in the show. At the start, we get a very clear picture of what the relationship is like between the two. Orel loves his father very much and looks up to him. He trusts him implicitly and always tries his best to abide by his teachings and listen to him. Clay is one of the main sources of the biblical lessons that Orel follows, and he tries to follow these lessons as best he can. The problem is, Clay's lessons are often confusing, contradictory, or flat out wrong. This results in Orel misunderstanding and messing up somehow or causing problems, which then leads to him being belted in Clay's study and then corrected, being taught the true lesson of the episode, which is usually also wrong or confusing in some way. At times he straight up creates a new commandment that wasn't in the Bible to teach his son, dubbing them the Lost Commandments. They're usually a mixture of Clay's own opinions on things being presented under the guise of a religious teaching. Clay uses these made-up commandments as a way to further indoctrinate Orel into his way of thinking. Despite all of this, Orel loves his father and honours him, which makes sense as he's been taught to honour his father and not his mother, apparently. He doesn't see his father's mistreatment of him for what it is. Shown in the episode where he puts on a puppet show for the town, Orel sees his father as loyal and loving, portraying him as a puppy in the show. It's strange though, as I personally would say that this puppet looks more like a wolf. A rather menacing wolf who drinks a lot and talks at length about how he beats his son. This episode showcases just how obvious it is to everyone that Clay abuses Orel, but Orel of course doesn't see it this way. The audience can clearly see how abusive and harmful Clay is towards his son, as he punishes Orel for things that are usually his own fault, then delivers a meaningless or incorrect lesson afterwards. Clay refuses to admit fault in any way, including in how he raises his son, which leads to him just punishing Orel for his own failures as a father.
Also, you did follow my advice, kiddo, so punishing you would be an admission of wrongness on my part. And believe you me, that ain't gonna happen.
Orel has a very much rose-tinted glasses view of his father, not seeing or understanding that he's being abused. And as the show goes on, more of Clay's awfulness comes to light. We see Orel's faith in his father become slowly tested over time.
I think you might be too drunk.
Everything comes to a head in the infamous Season 2 finale, Nature. Here, Clay decides to take Orel on a father-son hunting trip, which is apparently a Puppington family tradition. It's soon made apparent, though, that Clay has no intention of genuinely bonding with his son, as he discourages him from bringing essential supplies and shuts down Orel's attempts of conversation in the car ride over. The trip itself almost immediately goes to hell as Clay starts drinking excessively, more than he already does in the show. He becomes quickly frustrated with Orel's ability to kill an animal, eventually just doing it himself. This all leads to the two of them in the evening sitting by a campfire. Clay is absolutely shit-faced and Orel is very clearly uncomfortable. This is different from what we're used to. Orel has never really shown this level of discomfort being around his father up until this point. It's likely because now, unlike the other occasions, Orel is completely isolated with his father. He's totally alone in this, faced with a much more intoxicated Clay than he is used to. It's a difficult scene to watch, as here we see Orel begin to open up to his father, voicing his concerns with Clay's drunken state, making it very clear that he's not comfortable around him. It's obviously very difficult for Orel to do this, as he chooses his words carefully, afraid of upsetting his father even further. He seems almost reluctant to do this, which makes sense considering how he's never done this before. Also, Clay is just scary. He's a scary man. Clay hears all of this and dismisses his son's concerns. Orel's attempts to set boundaries are ignored, and Clay instead blames Orel for the way that the trip has gone before going on a rant about how Orel should be more like him. His life, he claims, is sunny and blight. Not bright, blight. There's a difference. He then proceeds to break down to one of the most hard-to-watch scenes of the show, at least in my opinion. He cries about how he hates himself, causing Orel to tear up in sympathy despite the circumstances. Orel is still just a child after all, and hearing his father say something like this is upsetting for him, even though he likely does not fully understand why his father feels this way. Clay then goes off on a wild rant. He demands to know why his alcohol has quit working on him and starts comparing it to women, telling his son that they're worthless. His sudden breakdown is scary and disturbing, as we, the audience, are forced to watch this alongside a confused and increasingly afraid Orel. Clay venting to his son like this is extremely inappropriate, to put it lightly, and it's very distressing to watch him dump all of this onto his young son. The flies and bugs clinging to Clay in this scene is a neat bit of symbolism, showcasing how truly rotten this man is. It could also be a reference to the biblical story of the plagues, as God sent down locusts and flies to Egypt. Here, as Clay realizes and voices his hatred for his miserable life, he is seemingly facing the wrath of God himself. Orel begins to visibly fear his father, gripping the gun before accidentally firing. He misses his father and instead hits the last 2 bottles of alcohol. But knowing Clay, he probably wouldn't be as angry if Orel did actually shoot him. After being verbally berated by his father, Orel says this.
It's because you become a bad person when you drink!
And this, to me, is the beginning of the end of Orel and Clay's relationship. The moment where Orel finally sees Clay for what he is and calls him out. Gone are the rose-tinted glasses from before, now Orel understands and acknowledges how awful his father is. Clay, upon hearing this, proceeds to try and belt Orel right there and then, to really solidify what Orel just told him. He struggles rather pathetically, and Orel even tries to help him at one point, only to be pushed away. Clay eventually stops and declares that it's time for his son to become a man, taking out the rifle. Then, in a drunken state, Clay proceeds to shoot his son in the leg. He immediately blames Orel for it, not taking the situation seriously at all. He then gets angry when he learns that Orel packed a first aid kit despite being told not to. He then proceeds to down all the medical alcohol right in front of Orel, prompting him to say this.
I hate you.
And this marks a definitive turning point in both Orel's relationship with his father and in the show itself. At the start of the series, and for most of its runtime to be honest, you'd never expect Orel to say this to anybody, let alone his father. Just goes to show how much things have changed since the start. If the earlier confrontation broke the rose-tinted glasses, this moment shatters them entirely. Clay's response only confirms this.
Hate away, sister. Hate away.
He directly acknowledges his son's hatred of him, he just doesn't care. You could make the argument that he only said this because he was drunk, but to be honest, I'm not so sure. After Clay passes out in a drunken state, Orel's left alone to bleed out. A bear approaches soon after, and Orel is forced to do the one thing he desperately did not want to do on this trip. He has to kill the bear. Just, another piece of trauma to really destroy that childhood innocence. Orel lies there for hours until Clay finally sobers up enough to wake up and take his son to a hospital. Not before spotting the dead bear and demanding that Orel tell him that he shot it. And Orel lies to his father, telling him that Clay was in fact the one who shot the bear. Before, Orel would have done anything to gain his father's approval and make him proud. Now though, after the events of the previous night, he can see that it's not worth seeking approval from this man anymore. The ending of the episode has Orel asking his mother why she chose to marry Clay, receiving a very blasé response. He then brings up how Clay changes when he drinks, and Blaberta simply informs him that no, that's just his true nature coming out. The title of this episode now has a double meaning. It's called Nature because, well, Clay and Orel were out in the nature. It also has relevance in how Orel can see his father for what he really is. He's been shown his father's true nature in its entirety, and now he understands it. And so, the way he sees his father is changed forever.
Over and over and over and over and over and over and over.
Okay, Clay, I get the point.
No, you don't!
Now let's take the time to discuss Clay, shall we? Oh, what a joy that will be. Clay is probably the most complicated character in the show and is by far the worst person. Clay is the exact opposite of his son. While Orel is optimistic, hopeful, and overall rather joyous, Clay is cynical and hateful. He spends his time wallowing in his own misery and seems to almost revel in it, as well as in the misery of those around him. He serves as a deconstruction of the typical 1950s type of nuclear family. On the outside, he appears to have it all, a family, loving wife, but make no mistake, this is all just another act that's being put on. Clay hates his life. He hates his wife Blaberta, and we've just discussed how fucked up his relationship with his eldest son is. In case you were wondering, Clay basically ignores Shapey as well. Clay is an utterly miserable person, but what made him this way? We learn about Clay's childhood in Season 3. He was raised by a very religious mother, Angela. Angela spoiled Clay terribly, to the point of ignoring her husband, Arthur. This was all due to the 10 miscarriages she had before having Clay, none of which were caused by anything she did, such as smoking or anything, Clay had a very close relationship to Angela, being very much a mother's boy. If Angela was alive today, she'd probably be considered one of those boy moms, In fact, part of me wonders if Clay's Christianity is fueled entirely by his mother's own religiousness rather than any genuine beliefs. That, and it's an easy way to impose control onto those around him, of course. Upon learning that he was in fact not Angela's only child, Clay grew extremely jealous and proceeded to play a prank on his mother. A very harmless prank, one involving a fake suicide of his father's gun, which resulted in his mother having a heart attack and fucking dying. Something to point out is that during the scene, Angela declares that there are no accidents, which Clay then repeats to Orel right before shooting him in nature. I just thought that was interesting. From then on, things were forever changed for the young Clay. His father grew to resent him and would soon begin to beat his son. However, Clay then started to seek out the abuse, seeing it as a good thing. In Clay's eyes, his father's abuse was almost a sign of affection. It meant that he was worth paying attention to. It was pretty much the only attention his father ever gave him going forward, and at that point Clay was willing to take anything. There is perhaps something to be said then about Clay's own abuse of Orel. Perhaps he sees it as a way to show affection for his own son. After a while, Arthur recognized what was happening with his son and sought to put a stop to it. This culminated in him attempting to end the Puppington family tradition of a father-son hunting trip. Clay as a child never went on his own trip with his father and so had no reference for how one should go, which could explain how unequipped he was with his own trip with Orel. Clay's father gave him the gun as a means to end the tradition, but Clay vowed to continue it. In other words, Arthur attempted to end the cycle of abuse, but Clay continued it with Orel. We don't know anything about Arthur's upbringing, so whether he began the cycle of abuse with Clay or was simply continuing it is unknown. Nevertheless, Arthur may have tried to end the cycle, but he still irreparably changed his son beforehand. Great job, man. Quick little aside to discuss Orel and Arthur. Orel was sent to live with his grandfather for some time as a young child, and the two grew close. Arthur acted as a proper father figure to Orel and was actually the one to first introduce him to the topic of faith and God. Unlike everybody else in Marlton, though, he didn't try to push it onto him. In their time together, Arthur attempted to set Orel on the right path and taught him about being careful and trusted others. Upon his return to Marlton, Orel was immediately pushed into the religious ways of the town as Clay decided that God was the answer to all of Orel's questions. It seems that a big part of why Clay raised Orel to be as religious as he did was as a way to one-up his father. Arthur Puppington is not a good person. His abuse of Clay is what served to mold him into the person we see in the show. However, he at least tried in some way to undo the damage he caused by caring properly for his grandson. As a young adult, Clay was actually rather similar to Orel. He appeared calmer and mild-mannered, preferring to spend his days alone reading the Bible. However, this changed upon meeting Blabberta, who was the one to introduce him to alcohol. Now, some people who watch the show seem to believe that it's all Blabberta's fault that Clay is the way he is due to her introducing him to alcohol. I think this is quite wrong, honestly. While meeting Blabberta certainly shaped Clay going forward in the worst way, he ultimately is the way that he is due to this and a combination of his upbringing, as well as the uber-religiousness of Marlton. Alcohol just serves as a means to bring his ugliness out into the world. It's as Blabberta says to Orel, he doesn't change when he drinks. It's just his true nature making an appearance. The part of him that he tries to hide around others to keep up the holy and good image he has in the town. I honestly could make a whole video discussing just Clay and Blabberta, and maybe I will one day. But for now though, just know that these two cannot stand each other, but they stay together to keep up the image of a healthy marriage. Onto the subject of Orel and Clay once again, we obviously see their relationship through Orel's idealized version of Clay, with the audience realizing along the way how awful Clay is to his son. For instance, Clay has a tendency to talk to his son in a way that you probably shouldn't talk to a child. His lessons, as already mentioned, are oftentimes incorrect and not actually helpful, often leading to Orel making more mistakes as he tries to carry out what he's been taught. Clay will get really cynical sometimes when talking to Orel, bringing up depressing subjects such as how love apparently fades away eventually, so we begin to lie to ourselves.
How long does it actually take for love to fade?
Oh, quicker than you think, kid. Quicker than you think.
You know, normal things to tell a young, impressionable child. There's also the whole nature rant, where he inappropriately overshares and begins to dump his personal issues onto his son, although Orel likely does not fully understand what his father is talking about here. Probably for the best, honestly. Clay often seems like he's trying to make his son miserable on purpose with his advice. This leads to a big part of Clay's character, his desire to make others as cynical and depressed as he is. Clay seems to thrive off of the misery of others. As seen in the episode Sacrifice, Clay spends Easter in the bar instead of with his family. Several other men from the town enter, most in a state of upset. And here we see Clay go out of his way to bring up the insecurities of the men around him, deliberately fueling their misery. Instead of perhaps trying to bond with others in a healthy manner, maybe sharing their problems with each other, Clay instead seeks to make the others feel worse. This seems to be a pattern with Clay. Instead of seeking to deal with his problems properly, he instead projects his own depression onto others to try to drag them down to his own level. With the other adults, it's clear that he does this out of some sort of sick sense of satisfaction at seeing them in conflict. With Orel, though, it seems to have different motivations. To me, Clay seems to want to mold Orel into another version of himself. He wants his son to take on his own twisted worldviews and be like him. In his own messed up way, perhaps this is Clay reaching out, by trying to make Orel think like him in an attempt to find solace in somebody, anybody. All he has to do is try and spread his own jaded worldviews onto his son, and then by having someone around that's like him, he won't feel as alone. He likely feels the closest to Orel out of the family and spends the most time with him due to his desire to turn him into a sort of mini version of himself. Clay seems to believe that he is a good father and is doing the right thing in his approach of raising Orel. This can be linked back to his own childhood. As already stated, maybe his own abuse of Orel is partly done as a twisted form of affection. The way Clay shows love for his son is just so odd. Like, he literally says this to him in the first episode.
I love you enough.
I wonder if Clay is genuinely even capable of truly loving his son due to the, well, everything about him. He seems to see Orel less as his son, but more of an extension of himself. That's why he's always so concerned when Orel makes his town-altering mistakes. He's worried about how everything will impact him, and how Orel's behaviour reflects on him. I mean, he is the mayor, after all, but still. Returning to the series, let's look at Clay's reaction to the aftermath of the hunting trip. He actually overhears Orel and Blabberta's conversation about him and his alcoholism. Not only that, but he witnesses Blabberta briefly break down when she believes herself to be alone. Upon noticing Clay standing there, though, she shuts down completely and storms away. Considering how most of the time Blabberta is mostly detached and unconcerned with what's going on around her, seeing her break down like this is a hard-hitting moment. She's finally seeing how bad things are in the family and it upsets her greatly. It only took her son getting shot by her husband, but still. Meanwhile, how does the person who actually did the shooting act? Does he apologize or try to fix things with his son? Well, considering Clay's previous habits of refusing to admit wrongdoing, I think we can guess the answer here. He doesn't show any guilt surrounding the incidents. He never apologizes to Orel or even really acknowledges it. That is, until a pivotal episode, that being the already mentioned sacrifice in Season 3. This is a very important episode for Clay. Here he discusses with the other men the theme of sacrifice and how he sacrificed for his family. He then monologues again about how difficult and depressing his life is and how much he struggles as a result.
That maybe there was a jerk-off called Darwin after all. And that you never acknowledged his existence because you knew deep inside that you were really what you feared you were. Weak and passive and ultimately broken by the ones who were made the fittest.
At one point he acknowledges the pain he causes his family, comparing it to a poison that in turn poisons those he loves. This moment here is probably the closest we'll ever get to Clay actually admitting guilt for the way he treats his family. He genuinely does feel bad about everything he's done, but instead of actually admitting to his wrongdoings, he goes back to ranting, and then begins to once again push the buttons of the men in the bar. He tries desperately and rather pathetically to get them to fight him, but they all refuse and simply leave him there to wallow in his misery.
With all you people as role models, no wonder my son is sensitive.
This is such a defining moment for Clay, and it perfectly encapsulates his character. Clay is, to put it bluntly, an utterly pathetic and pitiable person. The men in the bar realize this as he tries to goad them into striking out at him, and they decide to leave as there's no point in giving Clay what he wants. He's simply not worth it. Clay is desperate for any form of attention, even if it's harmful. This is of course due to his childhood abuse at the hands of his father. He in turn strikes out at others and hurts them, deliberately seeking to make others as miserable as he is. Clay is an utterly broken person who lives a miserable life. He is sympathetic, yes, but still very much hateable. Personally, any sympathy I could have for this guy goes away the moment he decides to take it out on his family. The thing is, though, is that he does seem to feel guilt for the harm he causes his family, as already mentioned. He is well aware of how awful he is to them and the pain that he brings. He directly witnesses Blaberta's breakdown, and his son literally tells him to his face that he hurts him when he drinks. Clay has ample opportunities to change, to try and be better for those around him, the ones that he supposedly cares about, but he never does. This brings us back to the subject of the video, that of course being change. Clay hates himself very much for the way that he acts, but he can never bring himself to try and genuinely change. This is likely because he would have to admit that he was wrong in some way, and as already established, he can't do that. Clay knows how awful he is, but doesn't want to change, and so he instead embraces his awfulness fully and continues the cycle. It's as he says during his rant and sacrifice, he'd do it over and over again.
How are things?
I think we should get right to the lecture and punishment because I have a lot to do.
You may be wondering why I just went off on a huge section about Clay when this video seems to be about Orel. Well, I did this because I wanted to discuss how Orel himself differs from his father, specifically in the way that he changes compared to Clay. See, there's that word again. To do this though, let's get back to the series and continue looking at the aftermath of the hunting trip, back with Orel's perspective this time. Going forward into Season 3, we continue to witness a dramatic shift in Orel's perception of his father. He's now entirely disconnected of Clay. Any interaction of him is now devoid of emotion, as Orel acts entirely deadpan when talking to him. Orel seems to try and rush through any interaction of Clay, trying to get it over with as soon as he can. After the hunting incident, Orel now sees through his father. He no longer has any respect for him, and he's not afraid of him either. Clay just isn't worth getting angry or overly emotional with. Clay takes note of his son's changing attitude, and it clearly bothers him. He seems to go out of his way to try and provoke Orel to get a reaction out of him, but to no avail. He could probably tell that Orel no longer blindly respects him, and this of course would get under his skin. The shift in dynamic threatens Clay's image as the strong leader of the household. He tries to act like how he usually does with Orel, going through the whole routine in the study, although a tad more awkwardly. But Orel is now familiar with how this all works and just wants to get it over with. Clay can sense that his control over Orel is slipping, and this worries him. Orel mentions during this confrontation that it's been months since the initial incident, and Clay hasn't tried to talk to him about it or seemingly shown any remorse over this period. Clay has had ample opportunities to at least try and apologize to his son and make things better, but of course he hasn't. It's not just Orel's relationship with Clay that changes, Orel himself begins to change. He doesn't act like his usual chipper self and is noticeably more subdued and sadder. Understandable considering everything that's gone on, honestly. His change in behaviour is noticed by the adults around him. For instance, during a rather somber sermon where the whole town seems miserable, Reverend Puddy looks to Orel to lighten the mood. However, upon seeing that even Orel is clearly down, the Reverend loses hope himself. Seeing the usually upbeat and joyous Orel acting like this is not only upsetting, but it speaks to how much things have changed over the course of the show. This is a far cry from the Orel that we met at the very start of the series. Going forward, Orel soon finds himself back into conflict with his father during the mayoral campaign due to Orel endorsing his opponent, Miss Sensidol. Clay eventually approaches Orel and begs him to tell him her plans after very half-heartedly apologising for shooting him. He's only apologising once he needs something from his son, and upon being turned down, Clay immediately throws it back into Orel's face, saying this.
Okay, well, I take everything back! And I'm glad I shot you.
As if this man couldn't get any more vile. This moment only further cements Orel's newfound attachment of his father. The moment it seems that Orel is about to try and connect with Clay after all this time, even just a little bit, he is shut down instantly. This interaction simply serves to prove him right in his hatred of Clay. Not only this, but Clay seems to give up on Orel himself after this. He tells Coach Stopframe at the bar that he apparently can't stand to look at Orel anymore because he's too sensitive. He couldn't even be bothered to pick up his son from the hospital because he was too busy venting to his bestie/boyfriend at the bar. The father of the year, everyone.
Oh, it's no use. You can't show me what there is to honor my father about, because there's nothing honorable about him.
Orel.
Despite all of this, Orel feels guilty for no longer respecting his father. It makes sense considering how he was raised, but still. Clay of course encourages this guilt, loudly preaching about honouring your father when he knows that Orel is listening. Orel decides to go to the Reverend for advice, who encourages him to come in and talk. Quite a far cry from the man who would sneak away from Orel before. Orel opens up about the guilt he feels for not honouring his father.
I don't honor my father.
Yeah, well, usually I'd say that was bad,
No.
And the Reverend advises him to find someone who likes Clay and talk to him about the good things about him so that Orel can find something worth honouring about him.
Coach Stopframe.
Oh. Okay.
And so Orel goes to Coach Stopframe. We learn from the coach that Clay has been lying about the hunting incident, telling all sorts of different stories to different people. Clay cares so little about what he did that he cannot even be bothered to come up with a coherent and consistent lie. Orel asks the coach what's worth honouring about Clay, and the coach struggles to answer. If Orel had approached him sooner, I'm sure it wouldn't be too hard for Coach to answer, but after what he witnessed Clay doing with Miss Sensidol, even the coaches began to turn his back on Clay. This brings us back to the subject of change, and see, there's the title. All throughout the show, the coach has basically been Clay's biggest supporter and enabler, sticking by him despite how little redeeming qualities the man has. Seeing him kind of cheating on him, is this cheating? I don't know. Changed him, though. Ironic considering that Blaberta cheated on Clay with the coach, only for him to use her as a means to get closer to her husband. The Coach Stopframe also just sucks, there's no denying it. But this episode seems to bring out a different side to him. Coach Stopframe instead avoids answering Orel's question and distracts him with a day out. The two have a nice day together, they actually bond and they both begin to cheer up. Throughout the episode we see a very bothered Clay watching the two. I mean, I don't know why he's so upset, I thought he was done trying to parent Orel. Maybe seeing the coach acting as a proper father figure to Orel is what bothers him, or perhaps he's so selfish that seeing the coach having fun with somebody that isn't Clay is making him jealous. I'd say it's a bit of both. Despite apparently swearing off of trying to be a father to Orel, seeing another man fill in this role probably hurts his ego quite a bit. There's also his attachment to Stopframe to discuss. The coach is probably the only slightly positive relationship he has in his life, and the only one that brings him any real joy. This is likely due to how much the other man enables him and pays attention to him. Clay thrives off attention after all, so a person who constantly provides him with this attention would easily become his favourite person to be around. Clay does seem to love the coach, but it's likely only because the other man gives him exactly what he wants. Orel and Stopframe end up decorating a Christmas tree together, with Orel actually having a good Christmas. Last year his parents were fighting and on the verge of actually divorcing, so the family did not spend Christmas together. This year though, Orel has actually had a good time. He soon begins to ask the coach about his relationship with his father, giving us this absolute gem of a line.
Coach, you like my dad the way my mom likes my dad, don't you?
Your mom likes your dad?
Orel then correctly comes to the conclusion that there's nothing worth honouring about Clay, and that it's useless to even try to find any reason to respect him. There's just no use in looking for anything good in Clay anymore, and yeah, he's right. It's still quite upsetting seeing Orel finally admit this, though. Stopframe speaks up and tells Orel that actually there was one good thing that Clay has done.
Orel, somehow, in his own blundering way, your father made you. And that's honorable.
This moment is sweet and also shows the coach's development. Up until this point, Coach Stopframe has been a very selfish person, but in this episode, we see him go out of his way to help Orel and make him feel better. In Orel's quest to find the good in his father, he instead bonds with the coach and has a good Christmas. Of course, this peace cannot last as Clay, overcome with jealousy, drags the rest of the family over to the coach's house under the guise of Carolyn to confront the other man. He soon begins to angrily rant at the coach, prompting Orel to interrupt and once again open up about how miserable he's been at home. He hasn't felt comfortable at home for ages, and now he's finally found a place where he can relax and feel at ease. Clay is of course unfazed by this, not caring about his son's discomfort with being in his own house. He accuses the coach of using Orel to get to him, and if this had happened earlier in the show, he'd probably be right, but the coach has changed and instead spent time with Orel out of a genuine desire to help him. Clay soon begins to break down, professing his love for the coach while poorly pretended to be talking to Orel instead. Didn't he just accuse Stopframe of using Orel to get to him? If this love confession had happened sooner, the coach would have probably been overjoyed. Instead, we see him simply staring at Clay, unimpressed and unreactive. A look we've seen before from Orel himself. Coach Stopframe simply tells him that it's too late, with Clay giving in and leaving in utter defeat. Though not before seeing the coach express his happiness at spending Christmas with his son. One more nail in the coffin that is Clay's ego at this point. In the span of one episode, Coach Stopframe has changed a lot. He's begun to act less selfish and has finally realised how awful Clay is, deciding to cut him loose. In doing so, Clay loses the one relationship he had that brought him any genuine happiness. He's basically lost everything, and it is all his fault. See, the people of Marlton are awful, as I've stated previously. However, over the 3 seasons of the show, we witness them as they begin to grow and change, usually due to Orel's influence. Blaberta started off as someone who didn't pay much attention to her family and neglect them. However, after it finally sinks in how awful everything is for her family because of her husband, and seeing how this is affecting her son, she breaks down. Following this, we see her begin to pay more attention to Orel, such as helping him with his work with Miss Sensadol's campaign. She seems to genuinely want to engage with him. Does this make up for the years of neglect? Probably not. The point is that she's changing and feels guilty for how things have been. There's also Arthur Puppington, who we've already discussed. Had the show continued, he would have tried to reach out to Clay to make up for how he treated him. He also would have continued to be a good grandfather to Orel and tried to set him on the right path. Arthur acknowledges the damage he's done and seeks to undo it through properly caring for Orel. He knows about the damage that Clay has caused his son and tries to change things for the better by being a proper guiding figure for Orel. Whether this all makes up for the damage these people have caused is up for debate. The point is that they're trying to change, they're making an effort to be better, unlike a certain mayor of Marlton who never even tries. Clay, despite having years of countless opportunities to do so, never changes. He never tries to be better and instead chooses to not only wallow in his misery but actively spread it to others. He could have tried to be better than his father in raising Orel, but instead continued the cycle of abuse. Clay could have decided to divorce Blaberta at the end of season 1, which is probably the healthiest thing these two could have ever done, but they stay together, simply to continue to keep up appearances, despite hating each other so much and creating an uncomfortable home life for themselves and their children. Clay never even properly apologizes for shooting his son, and instead doubles down and uses it as a way to hurt Orel further. Clay throughout the show, unlike most of the other characters, never changes, and so he is doomed to be forever miserable in his unhappy, unfulfilled life. The same cannot be said, however, for Orel. The final moments of the show have us travelling into the future and a flash forward to Orel's life as an adult, and what we see is kind of incredible. We see a grown-up Orel with a family of his own, having gotten married to Christina, and they all look very happy. They're having a wonderful Christmas together, and it's made very clear how much Orel loves them. He's a loving father to his children, unlike Clay. On the wall we see pictures of not only his brothers, but his parents. He still cares about them after everything that has happened. Although they don't look too happy in the photo, clearly staying together hasn't made them any more happier after all this time, though who would have guessed? The most crucial detail in this scene, to me, is the cross on the wall. After everything that has happened, Orel is still a Christian. He's managed to keep his faith throughout his life into adulthood. Despite all the trauma that would have come from the way he was raised and from living in Marlton, he still retains his faith in God. This makes sense, to be fair, though. As already discussed, Orel is someone who always kept believing in God no matter what happened. He has remained a Christian because his faith was always genuine, unlike many of the adults that surrounded him for his childhood who tried to push him into their backwards ways of thinking when it came to religion. After everything, he still has faith in God. Orel has clearly grown into a much better man than his father ever was and has broken the cycle. If Orel hadn't have changed throughout the show, he probably would have ended up like Clay, miserable and cynical. However, he did change and grew as a result. As an adult, he still seems to be the happy and joyous Orel that we've all come to know and love, but things have changed for Orel, and he's managed to find his own way in life without being dragged into the harmful mindset that much of Marlton lives by. In fact, Orel apparently still lives in Marlton as an adult to try and improve things in the town. He's much better than me, I would have gotten the fuck out of there. Orel has everything that Clay never managed to get. He has a genuinely loving marriage with a woman he clearly adores, a happy home, and a good relationship with his children. Note the lack of a belt on Orel himself. He's clearly not raising his children using the abusive methods his own father used on him. Just as Clay is a reflection of what path Orel could have gone down, Orel is a reflection of what Clay could have been like if he had just tried to fix things and be better, if he had just changed. But he didn't. And unlike his father, Orel is able to live happily in a life that he genuinely enjoys. It's quite an uplifting ending for the show, all things considered. It's very much earned on Orel's part, though. All throughout the show, we follow this kid as he tried his very best to abide by the messed up teachings the adults pushed onto him, all while still trying to remain a good person. Orel does change as a result of everything. We see him become miserable and confused for a time, but in the end, after everything, he is able to retain his happiness and live a good life. You know, in life things do change, and we may find ourselves changing into somebody we may not like, someone who may not be recognizable from the person we were once known as. As covered extensively in this video, change can be a good thing, but it's also scary and strange at times, and it may not always be for the better. But that doesn't mean it has to stay that way. There's always time for us to get better, to return to a better headspace and find ourselves again, return into who we once were and becoming all the happier for it. It's important to keep the lessons we've learned along the way though, no matter how challenging they may be. We don't have to let these experiences change us completely. It may be tough and it may take a while, but you can go back to the person you were meant to be. You just gotta have a little faith in yourself, I suppose. Thank you for watching.